thanks to everybody on the line here for joining us today to take a look at accessibility testing and the impacts on a developer's life. This is a follow-on conversation from my previous webinar a handful of weeks ago, where we kind of took a look at accessibility from almost from the product manager's perspective, or management in general. And so today we're going to take a shorter or more specific look at what does accessibility testing look like as a developer, in terms of, why do we consider accessibility in development? What can I do about accessibility in development? And then take a look at some demonstrations of different ways that a developer could test, find, and fix stuff, in their environments. So there we go. Just kind of laying out what we're going to be talking about today on this slide here, and exactly what I just said, right? We want to talk about why we do accessibility testing in development, what is the impact, or what does that look like in development, and then take a look at some demonstrations of some different ways to do that type of testing in development. So the first question of why, and some of this is going to be repeat content from the previous webinar, but for anybody who wasn't there for that, I still think it's important to set the table of, why do we consider accessibility testing in development? Historically, accessibility testing is something that was taken a look at post-production. So as we take a look at this agile diagram of a software development lifecycle, we see accessibility testing all the way off to the right under the full-on production environment, because that's how things are done. They're founded after production, and then we have to go back and fix them post-production, which is expensive, right? I mean, it's expensive to take apart a fully fleshed out product. So what Deque has often talked about in the industry is to shift left with accessibility, right? We should consider accessibility in design and consider accessibility in development during production, during the sprints, as well as in QA and scanning and monitoring post-production, because there's a lot that can be done upstream that makes it easier, cheaper, more cost-effective downstream. So specifically today, we're talking about the developer's chair and what he or she can do in that chair to check for accessibility as part of their everyday process, right? And that's because, as we look at this next slide, bugs caught in development are considerably cheaper and easier to fix than they are post-production. I mean, there's as we let some accessibility violation or bug move its way from development to build to QA to production, the scale of resources it requires to go back and fix that issue are quite literally orders of magnitude. So this diagram here is just sort of highlighting that at the various stages of development, the different scales of average cost to find and fix a bug, from development all the way out to maintenance or post-production, right? So this is why we consider accessibility in development is purely a cost argument. It just makes more sense to find and fix stuff that you can do so reasonably in development. So as developers, how can we help? I understand why we should be considering accessibility in development, but what reasonably can developers do to assist in that matter? So really the first line of defense from a testing perspective is the development team. So there are automated tools, browser extensions, APIs and things that can be woven into processes that are already being used, good practices that are already being used, that developers can engage in from an accessibility perspective to find and fix stuff before code really leaves that development phase. So it's worth noting that it's completely unrealistic to expect all developers to push out 100% accessible content all the time. 100%, WCAG 2.0 AA or 2.1 AA or whatever standard of compliance people are looking for, 100% of compliance necessarily requires manual testing, because it requires a human interaction, a human interpretation to be able to identify certain accessibility violations. So it's not to say that we are expecting developers to find and fix all accessibility issues in any given product, but through automation and proper practices, up to 50% or more of the accessibility bugs in any given project can be identified through automation. A lot of these things are malformed HTML or housekeeping issues. And so, the lowest hanging fruit, the most common accessibility violations that are committed in a given project fall under that sort of housekeeping category, and can be found through automation, through leveraging things like the Axe tool or other enterprise solutions and APIs that can be woven into integrated testing. So what we're saying is that small efforts with the right tools in development can have large impacts. That empower developers to test while they're developing, to test before they check their code in at any given point, and then to test through the automated structures that may already be in place organizationally. So that was really the brief kind of run-up slides that I wanted to get into. The exciting part of this demonstration is I'd like to walk through some demonstrations of what some of those small efforts with the right tools can look like for a developer, and what they can find and fix, and how that might work. So with that, I am going to break from my slides and move into the demonstration portion of this webinar. So for the sakes of my demonstration, I am going to be working with a demo faux human resources application that me and some members of my solutions architecture team created here. We call this HR Ally demo app here. But if we want to see some kind of testing in process, the first, I think, line of defense that a developer can be using would be something like a browser extension, right? So if I want to inspect a component or page while I'm building, maybe I'm building this in my local environment. You can see I'm serving this up under localhost. I've just got this running in my local environment. I can use my browser extension to analyze my component very quickly and understand with a single click and a single glance, what issues do I have, where do I have issues, and how do I fix them, right? So for me in this example, I may be building out this register a new user form component. I'm working in, this is a React application. So I've got 6 instances of form elements without labels. That's all 6 of my form fields in this form. Because I'm familiar with the application I've created, I'm starting to think maybe I forgot to add in a label under my form control object here. So if I take a look at the source code, and I'll move into my editor now, I see that under my form control .jsx file here, it looks like for some reason I have commented out this label. And so if I undo that, recompile and throw that up, move back into my browser, I can run that scan again and see that indeed was my issue. So I fixed that. I'm now good to check in my code. It's Axe clean or a test clean, and it's ready to go. So this is like a small thing that I can do. You can see it takes just a couple of seconds to run that type of test in my environment to find the issue, fix it, and move on, knowing that I've done what I can to fix some stuff in development, so that the QA tester downstream doesn't have to find it, or we don't let that get all the way into production and fix it later, which could cost 100 times more time and money and resources for my team. So that's a very small effort that I can use. Kind of looking at this in a little bit more of a sophisticated way, maybe I want to test a user flow. Maybe I want to automate this process, right? So I want to be able to go through some common task that a user might do, like maybe log some time. Maybe I was working on project alpha, and I need to put in some notes and log some time. Or what have you. Then now I could land on this page, and I could use my browser extension and scan it and take a look and then go through all the things manually. But that might take a while, and it's not super repeatable if I want to make changes and do that. So maybe I want to script out that testing. So if I want to do so, I have a couple options, right? I could build out a full-on end-to-end or automated testing pipeline to test that flow, but that might be a considerable effort. So maybe I want to work on something that's a little bit more lightweight and ad hoc. So there are tools that do exist that allow me to create lightweight scripting specifically for accessibility. In the WorldSpace toolkit, WorldSpace Attest toolkit, there's a tool called AGET, or the Attest Getter, which allows me to create a user flow using near natural language commands. So I'm now back in my editor, and we're looking at a JSON document where I've actually coded up a series of actions on a number of different pages within my application that mimic that user flow and allow me to move through those different actions and run an analysis at various points throughout the flow. And so then I can use my command line to run that command, and I just realized that I can just run a get, and it will bring up a browser and step through this series of commands and run some analysis interstitially to give me a series of scan data that will then be compiled into a single report that I can use for me. You could imagine this is part of a maybe CI/CD process. So if I want to tie this into my Jenkins server, I can by either passing the HTML report, or we can format the results as a JUnit XML report. But the goal here is that I can take this script, this automated test, and make it part of a larger testing structure, right? So if I've got an instance of Jenkins running and I'm doing a bunch of tests as part of a build, I can bring in my accessibility data through a post-build action and start passing my accessibility testing information into the same reporting structure where I'm doing the rest of my testing. So this is another small action with the right tool that's very powerful, right? I'm going through this data-driven user flow, leveraging as much automation as I can, so that I want to make sure that, you know, as I make updates to the UI for my HR application, that the user action of being able to log a PTO request or enter a timesheet is still as accessible as I can make it in development without going through some considerable testing efforts, right? So this is a low-cost, high-impact automation play that allows me to test for that user flow and do it, you know, ad hoc in the moment, or make it part of that automated testing pipeline. Now, I think the third use case that I want to talk about today would be maybe I'm part of a more sophisticated development organization and I have a wealth of testing automation already in place. We've already written out a series of end-to-end or component unit tests that are leveraging automation and pipelines in place to do all sorts of functional front-end testing. Accessibility testing can become part and parcel of that testing through leveraging our APIs that are also part of the toolkit. You know, the browser extension and the attest getter CLI are sort of abstractions layered on top of that API, but we do also expose the API itself. And so developers can take those APIs and make them part of the existing automation they might have already spent, you know, toiled many hours, blood, sweat, and tears over that is already in place, and we can just piggyback right off of that. So for me, in my application, I have unit tests already built to test something like my form control. And so this is a functional unit test. It's making sure that anywhere I'm using this form control, that it's got all the proper attributes and things as part of that form control structure. And if I want to inject the accessibility as part of that test spec, I can simply add in this accessibility helper. A couple lines of code allow me to piggyback off that existing automation architecture and pipeline to give me the accessibility testing as part of that testing that I'm already doing. So this isn't even adding an extra step to any build or any process. This is testing we're already doing, and I can make accessibility part of that testing. Again, a small investment of time and resources to make accessibility part of that, large impact to make every time we run this unit test. I'm now also checking for accessibility and can find and fix stuff at the point of build now, or whenever this unit test is running, instead of letting that stuff get down to QA. And for me here, I can run this as part of. I think I need to sudo that, otherwise it's going to complain about permissions. But you'll see it'll run through that test and push out to the console, you know, which different things passed, which different things didn't pass, and it looks like my form component. Now that I've added back in those labels, everything looks great, and I'm ready to move on. Similarly, this is generating reports, as you can see in the second to last line and the third to last line of the command line here, where we're pushing out an HTML report as well as a JUnit XML report. It's notifying me where those things are going, which was a specification in the test itself, so that I know I can go back and find my HTML or XML reports, which I can bring up here to provide me with all that same information we were pulling out of the browser extension. I want a list of what was wrong, where it was wrong, and links to Deque University to provide me with nice deep dive discussion on how do I fix this issue. What's wrong? I've got insufficient color contrast. Will provide me with some solution information about what colors can I use that provide a sufficient level of contrast to meet my compliance needs. So kind of in summation, with all these different strategies, the main goal is to make small changes leveraging the proper tools and the right rule sets so that I'm very quickly able to identify what's wrong, where's it wrong, and how to fix it. And I think that proper rules aspect is important, right? We don't want to be deploying rule sets that generate false positives, because then developers are going to go on wild goose chases trying to find issues that don't really exist. So for me personally, I like using the Axe Core rule set because it gives me that no false positives assurance, so that when something is reported as an issue, I know where it is, I can go fix it, and move on with my day without having to waste time finding something that's not there. So I probably was moving at too fast of a clip, but we've hit our 10 minutes left for QA line, and so I think now would be a good time to field any questions that have come through.
Great, thanks, Noah. Have one here. So during the slides, you mentioned HTML quality issues. This person uses Axe and encourages their devs to use it too. However, sometimes we strongly encourage HTML validation first because some browser fix-ups of bad HTML can mess with Axe results. Do you agree that following standards and having strong code is an important first step?
I think so. I mean, that kind of falls back on training. Like you're kind of talking about making sure that people are in the know and aware of proper coding standards and training. And I think that that's a fantastic foundation of any organization. And so I think that's wise. And you're absolutely right about the sort of browsers can get in there and muck things up. I know that with Axe, we have started to get into having rules around some of the shadow DOM stuff, which I believe is where some of that browser black magic kind of comes into play. So we're starting in the accessibility industry at large, we're starting to look at how does some of that shadow DOM browser black magic affect the accessibility aspect. So I think that HTML's standards and taking it from a training approach is a fantastic way to go about it. I'm seeing a number of questions about the WorldSpace extension versus the Axe extension. And you're absolutely right. So the WorldSpace extension is, you can think of it as the enterprise version of Axe. The WorldSpace attest is the enterprise software version of the Axe Core rules. It's essentially taking that Axe testing engine and marrying a number of enterprise features to it. So that's what that WorldSpace extension is. It's the WorldSpace attest browser extension that provides me with not only access to the Axe Core rules, but I can support custom rules or different standards as part of my testing, as well as different versions of Axe. And a number of other features like our Simulate 2 feature, which allows me to interact with my page and highlight a number of different page components so that if I want to see where are all the different headings on the page or links, these are sort of just generally helpful testing features. So the WorldSpace extension is the WorldSpace attest extension, which is sort of the paid-for enterprise version of Axe.
Great, thanks, Noah. I have another question here. So 50% of issues found while automated testing stat has been around for a while. Is that statistic still accurate for the 2.1 guidelines? In other words, can you tell us how applying automated testing to 2.1 has gone so far compared to 2.0?
That's a very interesting question. Yeah, 2.1 introduced, I believe, 12 or 14 new success criteria to the A and AA uh, uh, standards there. And we've got, I believe, 2 rules in the Axe core rule set now that address some 2.1 concepts. However, a lot of that additional success criteria was around, I know there was a lot of focus on mobile and cognitive. So from a web standpoint, there wasn't a ton of additional automation, at least early on, as we start looking at 2.1 to take on there. I would still stand by that 50% number, because when I say 50%, I'm not talking about 50% coverage of the success criteria for WCAG 2.0 or 2.1 AA, but I'm more speaking to, in any given project, up to 50% of accessibility issues that could be found with automation, which is to say that half or more of any of the accessibility issues that may present in a project are typically fall into that malformed HTML, that housekeeping issues. And so those are the things that can be found through automation. Like creating a keyboard trap is not something that can just be a small error from a developer. It's something sometimes you have to try. You almost have to try to make some of those more sophisticated accessibility barriers. And so when we talk about bugs found through automation, they tend to be those low-hanging fruit, much more common malformed HTML issues, which, again, I would still stand by that 50%.
Great, thanks. Another question here for you. Is there a way to use NUnit with the Axe core library?
Sorry, can you say that again? I was trying to read that along with you. I'm trying to find where that question is in the list, Laura.
Sure, yeah, it's in the chat.
Yeah, now, Mr. Browning. I am not familiar with NUnit as a technology. Can we maybe follow up over email with that?
Sure. Let me field another question here for you. So this person asks where you were using the ally helper in your enzyme tests. Are violations referring to general violations or ones that you've specifically indicated somewhere else?
For me, in the way that I was using this, I was testing for everything under WCAG 2.0 AA, and so it's going to give me all violations, nothing specific. So it's any violations found from that rule set would be reported.
Got it. Thanks. So another question here for you is more general. So how do people get organizational buy-in to go from testing single pages like you were with the browser extension amongst individual developers to perhaps testing an entire site across an entire dev team?
That's a big question. Typically, when we're talking about trying to justify organizational level changes, it always comes down to some sort of return on investment. And the reality is that when we start testing in those large automated structures, we're really able to find and fix more issues in development than if we're relying on the hard work of certain individuals, right? Now there is some sort of associated cost with deploying resources to integrate it, as well as probably necessarily licensing some software. But the return on that investment is considerable. And if that's something that you're looking into, again, maybe we could set up some sort of follow-up webinar to look at what that ROI calculation looks like, or we could connect on email and have that conversation. Because some of those things are organization-specific when you start looking at costs for testing and average number of issues found per application or per page or what have you. So it tends to be specific, but really what it comes down to is just a pure maths ROI conversation of this is what it would cost to implement such testing, but this is what we're getting in return.
Great, thanks, Noah. And next week, we just announced today, we'll be hosting a webinar about how to convince your boss to care about accessibility. We'll talk a bit more about that ROI, so I'll post a link to that in the chat for people to follow up on. But in the meantime, I have another question for you, Noah. Eric asks, how would you handle errors for developers? And should these errors or violations stop builds? Go ahead.
No, no, yeah. So this is as a practice, I can say as a practice from Deque's perspective, our tools, the World Space to Test Developer Toolkit, when you start working with our APIs, out of the box, we do not have assertions that will fail builds because that's really an organizational dependent thing. Where is the threshold of number of issues or types of issues per page or per build that we are willing to tolerate? So really, you can build an assertion around the test results. And so that really depends on your team and where you want to draw the line in terms of accessibility. We don't force an assertion on anybody because we simply want people to be testing for accessibility and finding these issues when they can. And so we don't want somebody to not use a tool because the assertion is too fine or too coarse in terms of what's allowable and what's not. So, it's really up to the organization about when you want to put a stop to the development velocity because of accessibility-related bugs found. So I don't have a clean answer for you, unfortunately. It really just depends on the tolerances allowed for your organization. But it's, you can always write the assertion around it.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we are at the end of our time for today's webinar. There are a few questions that we didn't get to, but we're going to answer those via email. So I just want to thank everybody for joining today's webinar. We'll send out the recording for this webinar and the slides via email later this week. Thanks so much.